For those of you who've lived underground in sanctuary communities all your lives, it may come as a shock that there was a time on the planet when people lived totally unregulated lives. People worked to survive. They were rewarded with imaginary units which they could exchange for food and shelter. These imaginary units were called dollars or pounds or euros or bolivars, depending on where you lived and worked. If you didn't work in a legitimate trade or profession, you were forced to break the rules of the community you lived in or die. If you were caught breaking the rules, you were either incarcerated or killed. The rules had ambiguous conditions attached that were known only to an enlightened few. If you had enough imaginary units, you could hire a member of the enlightened few who knew the way around the rules. If your enlightened representative convinced your captors that you had not really broken the rules, they would set you free. There were predatory professions where people earned their imaginary units preying on the biological urges or superstitious frailties of their fellow man. Human young were conceived inside a woman's womb. They were nurtured by feeding on the woman's body fluids. After 9 months, the fully formed fetus inched its way down the woman's cramped birth canal and was forcibly ejected through her dilated orifice. And everyone lived above the crust, outside sanctuary. Back in those days, our species, Homo sapiens, had systematically laid waste to the planet. According to science, the Earth had been home to the species for roughly 250,000 years. The planet itself has been around for at least 4 billion years, give or take a millennium. Don't ask, we don't know. Scientists found Homo sapien bones in Africa that date back 200,000 years. They found other Homo sapiens bones in Asia that date back 100,000 years. See the pattern here? The same scientists also surmise that dinosaurs died out shortly before Homo sapiens arrived on the planet. So anybody watching the old Flintstone movies might want to rethink the authenticity of the pet dino. It ain't exactly a legitimate documentary. To continue, it took Homo sapiens 200,000 years to trash the planet. They did this through a combination of ignorance, overpopulation, greed, and benign neglect. Let's examine overpopulation first. The planet can only produce enough resources to support a finite population. Your garden variety member of species Homo sapiens doesn't need much to make him or her happy. Food, potable water, minerals, shelter, and elbow room. Shampoo and shoe polish don't count. Multiply the resources required times the number of people. If your grand total is greater than the resources of the planet, you can do one or two things. Either increase the resources or decrease the population. Oops, religion rears its ugly head. Religion was invented to answer 3 age-old questions. Where did I come from? Where am I going? Why am I here? The problem is, religion has never been very good at providing rational answers to these questions. The rational answers provided by science may not always be correct. Sometimes new information is discovered, but the answers are usually based on hard facts. When religion doesn't know the answer to a question, it says, it's the will of God. Things might have been different had there been a modicum of quality control over the formation of religious organizations. As it was, each religion came up with its own set of answers to the 3 questions. And each answer came directly from the mouth of its God. And since the answer came from each religion's God, the answer was not open to debate. Because I said so, each God said in so many words. Oh, and by the way, kill everybody who doesn't believe in me. That directive kept the population under control for a few centuries, but that couldn't last. Most of the gods also said, go forth and be fruitful. Multiply in my name. Not a problem when the population of the known world hovers around a few 100,000. In fact, it's a good idea to keep those newborn babies popping forth when the likelihood of survival of said babies, given your icy winters, hungry wolves, crop failures, disease, tribal warfare, and drastically reduced life expectancy, serves as its own population control mechanism. But along come cures for diseases, weather forecasts, warm clothing, better nutrition, peace treaties, and well-fed wolves, and suddenly we're up to our armpits in people. At the beginning of the 20th century, the population of the globe was 1.5 billion souls. By the beginning of the 21st century, it had quadrupled to over 6 billion souls. That's a whole lot of boogie woogie going on. Midway through the 20th century, some rich folks in America raised the red flag. They called themselves the governors. If the overpopulation continues at the present pace, they prognosticated, by the time 2100 rolls around, we're going to be knee-deep in babies. Nobody wants to be knee-deep in babies, especially when the technology is there to prevent babies from forming. On the other hand, everybody wants to boogie woogie. Therein lies the dilemma. Religious leaders preached that boogie woogie without babies was a sin, unless the boogie woogiers, through no fault of their own, failed to make the connection. They realized not every shooter is a marksman. If your heart was in the right place during the unsuccessful attempt, just keep on boogieing. Even a blind hog turns up an acorn now and again. And finally, boogie woogie that results in successful fertilization inside the sacred womb can't be undone without invoking the everlasting wrath of one or more gods. Don't matter if it's rape or incest or roofies, or if the mother is in grave danger of losing her own life, or if the fetus had one big eye in the middle of its forehead and no legs to mention. It's all God's will. There were a handful of birth control methodologies that were acceptable to the various gods of the world. Abstinence was right up there at the top of the list. In the woman's case, she was told to take an aspirin every night and hold it between her knees until dawn. In the couple's case, they were instructed to use the rhythm method. Do you know what they call faithful adherence to the rhythm method? Parents. In the man's case, heck, there ain't no way you could keep a man from trying to make babies. It just isn't possible. Their animal instinct is too strong. So that, in a nutshell, is the overpopulation problem. Let's take a peek at the issue of greed. In the beginning, there was no concept of property ownership, or even of property for that matter. There was plenty of stuff to go around. Trees rich with ripened fruit, pools filled with fresh, cool water, small, shy animals for humans to kill and eat when other big, ferocious animals weren't trying to kill and eat the humans. Then man learned how to till the soil, or rather, taught woman how to till the soil while he was out hunting small, shy animals. Potatoes in the ground, tomatoes on the vine. It was all very orderly and bucolic until some guy who'd had a crop failure decided he needed to pilfer a potato or two from his neighbor. So the powers that be had to make a rule about don't steal your neighbor's stuff. About the only rule he had up to that point was don't kill your neighbor. Unless he has a different God from yours, but we've already covered that point. That was about the time they invented lawyers too. Who needs lawyers when nobody owns nothing? And they invented those imaginary units they called money. Now you could give your neighbor money in exchange for his potatoes. And he could give you money in exchange for kissing your wife. And so forth. Greed crept in when the neighbor figured out that kissing your wife wasn't nearly as fulfilling as eating his own potatoes. He loved his potatoes. He even loved his potatoes when he got sick and tired of eating potatoes because other neighbors wanted some of his potatoes. So he raised the price on his potatoes. His neighbors grumbled, but they paid up because they needed potatoes to survive. And suddenly it wasn't about potatoes and survival anymore. It was about those imaginary units that really had no particular value themselves. It was all about the money. And once you got your hands on some, it was never quite enough because you could never own it all. And finally, there's benign neglect. Time was a man had his own tools locked up in a shed back of the house. He'd use those tools to make himself a living. He'd keep the tools sharpened and shiny because they worked better that way. He was proud of his tools. By the same token, his wife had her kitchen where she cooked food. She kept her kitchen clean and neat because the food came out better that way. No dog hair in the gravy, so to speak. Along came the Industrial Revolution. Now the man went to work in a factory using tools owned by the people who owned the factory. They weren't his tools. He didn't even use the same tools every day. If he kept the tools sharpened and shiny one day and the next day he had to use some dull, shabby tools somebody else had used yesterday, he wasn't quite so diligent when it came to taking care of his tools. But he had more money, so his wife hired a cook. Now she wasn't quite as concerned if the kitchen floor didn't get mopped every day. And every now and then you'd find a dog hair in the gravy. But it wasn't the wife's fault. She could blame the new cook or the dog. Along came cars and pollution, and oil spills, and car crashes, and littering, and tire treads all over the road from blowouts, and sofas that fell off the back of trailers and just never got picked up. Man had no control over any of these things, and the environment suffered. But man shrugged his shoulders and said, "Ain't my problem." But it was. As it turned out, it really was.